Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
All right, Aviva, welcome to Beyond Belief podcast. And this is a very exciting episode because it is the 21st episode, and I've been towards this my whole life. Because I once read that the 21st episode puts you in the 99th percentile of podcasts. Most of them never reach this. So you're in a very significant and auspicious episode. And I will also warn the audience that you and I are in a relationship very similar to the relationship we were when you interviewed me.
Plus a few extra months.
Exactly. So that might play a part here. So diving in, I'm curious to hear from you how you would describe your religious upbringing, like what denomination, what background.
Yeah, I'm without like leaning on things you said about your upbringing. I would say I don't know, like Haredi broadly is how I would phrase it, if that means something to anyone. And just ultra-Orthodox in Israel, but not exactly Israeli. So there was like this kind of distinction between the education that I was getting outside of the home. So ultra-Orthodox Israeli was like the schooling I did and the friends I had, and maybe like the way I dressed. Like there were certain rules that were external to the being at home. And then in the home, it was much more American, I guess. Ultra-Orthodox, which I do think is different. Generally, my dad was also much more relaxed in lots of ways than my mom might say. She definitely bought into the Haredi thing more. So there was like a little bit of a distinction there. Like there was some wiggle room, maybe. This is all retrospective. I don't know if I would have defined any of it like this at the time. And I think it was like there was a bit of a liberal atmosphere, which is crazy to say. And I think it will become evident why it's crazy to say that. But yeah, I feel like the fact that I'm such a classical liberal in some ways these days does come from my upbringing. And then the other component is the curative component. So my parents also were really heavily engaged in religious outreach and making non-religious Jews more religious than they were. So I was exposed to that a lot. I was exposed both to like being around people, and then also like the talking points were a huge part of my upbringing. That's it.
So how would you describe almost like the difference between how your father was religious and how your mother was?
I think my dad is more of an intellectual. And so it wasn't a very felt sense for him. Like, I don't know, when he prays to this day, I don't exactly understand what that means, because I don't sense that he had a very emotional, relational aspect to his religiosity. He talks about the values of having that, but my sense is that like I've never experienced that from him. And my mom, I think, is generally a more like emotional person and maybe less rational, definitely less rational actually. And so she'll sort of like also tend to do more superstitious things that are associated with religion. I think there's a bit of a like Sephardi Ashkenazi divide as well, where she comes from more Sephardi roots, and it's kind of evident. And then she also just complied a lot more with like societal expectations, the expectations of the community, the neighborhood, like those things really, really mattered to her. Whereas my dad, I think, if he didn't see inherent value in the particular rules, he would sort of be like, he'd admit to that. He'd just say like, yeah, there's like really no point in this, but it's important to like fit in, or he would, in actuality, I would still have to do whatever the thing was, but he would not impart it to me as like, yes, this is inherently important, which was the messaging I was receiving from school and from my mom.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And you alluded to this before of like this being a retrospective, but at the time, were you aware that you guys were different? Your family was different?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit hard to make a distinction between like if we were different culturally, because I came from like an Anglo family and we were in an Israeli society, or religiously. Like, I don't know if I'd be able to draw those lines, but I was very aware that we were different.
Mm-hmm.
Even socioeconomically, I'd say I was aware that we were like better off. I grew up in the poorest neighborhood in Jerusalem, at least at the time it was. And my family wasn't by any means well off, but compared to the people we were surrounded with, they were like doing better.
Mm-hmm. And so in this sort of melting pot of different takes, right? A society around you and then the own home and then even between your parents, what was your relationship with religion?
I loved God. I have a lot of memories of like doing stupid things like going to sleep too late or not doing my homework or things like that. And I would pray. Like I would bargain. It'd be like, make these 5 hours of sleep be like 8 hours of sleep. Like I had a relationship with God. It was kind of like an imaginary best friend that was also omnipotent. I think, again, in retrospect, I don't think I ever really bought the like fire and brimstone version of religion, even though I was totally surrounded by it. I think I was like, nah, God gets me. Like he knows my intentions. He knows, and it's not that I never felt guilty for doing the wrong thing. I obviously did, but that wasn't a big part of my religious experience. Again, even though it was what I was being taught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm curious then, because that sounds almost like it's interesting because that manifests as the way a lot of less Orthodox Jews, like conservative and Reformed Jews, often will maybe speak of God that way. So it's interesting. I'm reminded of your liberalism that you referred to earlier. So based on that, the fact that part of you was maybe not fully bought in ever.
I just want to I wouldn't say that I wasn't fully bought in. I think I wasn't fully bought into some of the messaging, but in some ways I actually feel like I was more religious than a lot of like the people around me. Like I'd consider the way I related to God to be more devout in some ways than how I saw my dad relate to God. Because they truly, there was a true relationship there. I just felt like, I did feel like God was like a strict parent, but it felt like the emphasis was on the parent part. And then the strict part was just like a necessary means of some sort. And then if things were painful, it was because God loved me and knew what was best for me. Like those things, I really bought into that very, very strongly.
What about practices or laws? Did that have a place for you, or was it mostly philosophical, relational?
I mean, I practiced most of the things. I wouldn't say I was like the best adherer of the laws. I would do the ones that were ritual. I kind of liked for the ritual, and also they were easy because they were just part of my kissing the mezuzah on the door frame in and out of a room was like very easy to do, and I liked doing it right, but it didn't feel like existential. Like the capacity or the ability to do it right didn't feel existential. So I would try to, and I would often succeed. But if I didn't, it wasn't like, yeah.
The stakes weren't particularly high. If you didn't do it, then it was just an enhancer.
Yes, yeah. And I think it also depends on what you're referring to. Like, I really didn't feel like God cared what shoe I put on first. But when I remembered, I would try to put them on in the right order. But then there were other things like, I don't know, keeping 6 hours after meat that I felt like it was a worse sin because I'd be combining meat and milk, and that was like a biblical prohibition. And that was like, so there was like a range of how bad or good something was.
Yeah. Was there a particular law that particularly messed you up?
It's a good question. No particular laws coming to mind, but something about the continuous monitoring of my own behavior at all times, even when I was alone, because God was always with me. I think that messed me up on some level. And I also think it probably contributed in some ways to like other things. Like it was probably not only bad, but yeah, in terms of messing me up, I would say that messed me up. The fact that I was like never alone, always being watched. There was no like resting, like, okay, I'm off the hook.
Hmm. Yeah. I heard a rabbi describe being Jewish as a job description. And from an Orthodox perspective, it's not wrong. And it's like the job that never ends. It's like there's no vacation. It's like your job that you have 24 hours a day. And so I would quit a job like that, frankly.
Wait, one more thing that just came to mind that I think messed me up, and it's also more of a broad thing than a particular law. But it was the messaging that I couldn't trust my own sense of goodness or right or wrong. That like my moral compass, if you will, wasn't to be trusted. That I needed an external set of like rules to tell me how to behave, or I would definitely fuck up.
Right.
I think that, yeah, that actually probably fucked me up more than anything else. And I'm still in an undoing process around that in like different ways.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So overall, it sounds like a fairly healthy relationship with religion or with God in particular. So I'm curious what your process was then of leaving. In my mind, I feel like I'm jumping to there fairly quickly
Mhm.
in the podcast, but I'm wondering if there's really is, if you feel like there are milestones along the way to that leaving which is the topic here, or is it like, everything was good until it wasn't?
Right. I think that there were certain things that were never compatible for me with like how I viewed God, and they became more and more of an issue. Like I remember being really troubled by gay right and like Judaism's treatment of gay people. And it wasn't only because I considered myself to be one of them. It was because I felt like I had a choice. Like I could be maybe like basically fulfilled or happy also with men. So I don't think that alone would have pushed me, but it was more broad than that. I was like, it was obvious to me that it wasn't a choice, that people weren't choosing to be gay. And then I was like, why would God punish someone for something that they're not choosing? Like I could not reconcile that. And I think there were probably a few other things I think our transgender child contributed to that. The way that they were treated was like, just, I couldn't understand how that was compatible with like the God as I understood God to be. So those were like, yes, I still believe in God, but there's something wrong with the way it's being interpreted, enacted. I would say those are like early signs or things that I spent a lot of time thinking about / debating with people. Just an anecdote from what I was saying before. I remember I had this of not being able to trust my own like moral compass. I had a necklace that said, follow your heart. And my dad made me get rid of it. I don't remember what I ended up doing with it, but he was like, that's literally goes explicitly against the prohibition, like, "לא תטורו אחרי לבבכם," right? And he was like, why would you wear something that goes like explicitly against a passage that you say every single night before you go to sleep? And I was like, oh shit, you're right. And I got rid of it. I think I was upset because I liked the way it looked, like it was aesthetically nice. But I agreed with him wholeheartedly. Like that's why I said that's what I think fucked me up most, because I really bought into it. I was like, yeah, I can't trust myself.
The biblical verse that people say 2 or 3 times a day, it's on the wall. I don't know if it's a mezuzahs, but it's, do not follow your wayward mind or heart.
Yeah.
No.
Your wayward heart or eyes.
Eyes, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't follow your heart. That would make it real graphic.
Literally.
We should sell that on Freedom Fighter.
Don't follow your heart.
It's like our version of Live, Laugh, Love is don't follow your heart.
Yeah.
So I had follow-up questions for you about that. You mentioned being bi, essentially. Did you know at a young age?
I didn't know what that meant, but I was attracted to girls from basically the age of puberty. But I didn't, like I had no vocabulary or understanding that that was an option, or that it was even like what I was experiencing was even like the same kind, an attraction that was the same kind of attraction that I would then also experience with men.
So it was actually before you experienced it towards men.
Yes, it was. And that might just be because I was basically surrounded by women all the time. I like really wasn't around any men, definitely not boys my age.
Right. But then if it was so amorphous, then I'm wondering if it was a factor in like the gay rights types of feelings.
Oh, it wasn't. That's what I was saying. It wasn't a factor.
It wasn't. Okay.
I could see how like it could be, but or maybe it was in the sense that once I understood, I had more of a vocabulary about this and I understood my own attraction, I knew that I hadn't chosen it.
Hmm.
So in that sense, yes, in that sense, I was like, yeah, from my own experience, this isn't something that I chose to do to piss God off. Yeah.
Right. So, and then you mentioned gay trans and how they were treated, and it sounds like it was pretty personal, like this was in your own experience. Is it? Yeah. Can you tell me more about that?
I guess I didn't really, I mean, I didn't directly experience this aside from being extremely closeted. Like, I didn't really tell anyone about it because I
You were
kind of
saying maybe in the context of
Yeah.
our eldest of our child.
Yeah. I just remember, I remember how they would react to our child when they would like dress in certain ways. And they were like appalled. And this kid was like literally 2 years old. And even though I was still extremely religious, I was like, there's something wrong here. Like, this is just so weird to be threatened by. Like, that was their reaction. Like, they were threatened by the behavior. I remember trying to get them into a ballet class, and they wanted to join the ballet class as a little girl, not as a little boy. Like, they were not interested in wearing the little boy ballet outfit. They wanted to wear a leotard and tutu. And the teacher was like, yeah, no. And I was like, this kid, like, I think that they were still in preschool. So they were like maybe 5 years old. Yeah. I don't know, all these things. And even there, it was like so obvious to me that this child wasn't doing it because it was cool or because like basically anything that I had been taught wasn't proving to be true in this case. So I was
Mhm.
like, it made me question a lot of things about the philosophy. Maybe I'm just like trying to like find early signs. And I guess those could potentially be the early signs, but that's not really what did it, I would say at all.
What really did it?
It really so I had been listening to like debates and reading books that challenged the notion of God for years. And I was always reading them very much from this perspective of like talking points. Like, how would I argue against this as a person who, and I literally did this. I did a training seminar of how to talk to wayward Jews and convince them. And like, so I had to understand their arguments. And that was often, I think, how I was engaging with the material. Like if I listened to like a YouTube debate or a book, that's kind of where my head would be at. And then, and there was another big part in here, which was my relationship with my dad, where I really like trusted that he had, because he himself was a person who grew up secular and chose to be religious later in life. And I trusted that he had done the work to some extent. And I'm like, if he arrived at this conclusion, then he's probably right. And then I don't really need to do any more digging. So that was, I don't think I realized how much of a part that played, but I think that actually played a pretty big part in me not probing further. And okay, so with that context, I was seeing this life coach who really like changed my life in lots of ways. But one of the ways that he changed my life was that we worked directly on differentiation broadly, like in my relationships, and differentiation in my relationship with my dad was one of the things. And something there like really clicked, I think, emotionally. Like there was a kind of severing of, I don't know, because there was also something emotionally weird, like where I had this kind of sense of alliance with him. We were allied in some way. So doing that work, that psychological work really freed me to re-engage with these materials from like a much clearer perspective, with less bias. And I basically arrived at the conclusion that belief in God required some amount of faith, blind faith, which is something I was taught wasn't the case essentially my whole life, where you can logically arrive at the conclusion that God exists and you don't need any faith. There is no leap of faith. That's how we're different than the Christians. That's frankly how we're better than the Christians, right? And I remember like arriving at the conclusion and then talking to my dad about it and being like, if you had to give me a percentage of how much faith is required after all the logical proofs, what would the percentage be? And I think he said something absolutely preposterous, like 98%. He's like, it's 98% logical and you only need 2% proof to make, that's like, you only need 2% leap of faith. That's all that's required. And I said, well, what if I don't have that? What if I don't have the 2% leap of faith? And he was like, he's essentially my understanding, what I got out of it was like, yeah, then none of it works. The 2%, those 2% are essential to make the rest of it work. And I was like, well, fuck, I don't have that. I just don't. And which is crazy to say based on the fact that I had this like really strong sense of relationship, right? I think most people would consider that faith maybe. But for me, it was like, yeah, this doesn't make logical sense. Like the whole thing just like really fell apart. And I remember it felt like an overnight thing. That was, in my experience, it was like I went from believing in God to not believing in God in the span of 24 hours. And then I had a sense that I needed to do it more gradually, externally, and then even also in action, like that I needed to, whatever, stop doing certain laws or break certain prohibitions, that I needed to do that gradually for my own sense of well-being or psyche or integration. Like I kind of knew that, but I remember feeling like internally I was there and that this was some kind of way of me mediating what I was experiencing internally to like my external expression, the outer world, and almost like thinking it through. Like, what would a next little step look like? And what would the next little step after that look like? And how long do I have to do each thing for it to like, yeah. I remember someone, and I remember someone telling me in Hebrew, they said something like, "At midarderet," which means you're going downhill. And I was like, on one hand, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I want it to look like is happening. So I'm doing a good job. But then at the same time, I was like annoyed. I was like, no, actually, it's not that uncovering one's hair naturally leads to wearing pants. That's actually not what's happening here. Like internally, I'm already doing both of those things. I'm staggering it for your benefit, for whoever's like, because you were in my life. We had religious children that were going to religious schools. We lived in a religious community. Like there were consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to say that it felt like a breakup. That was my experience of it. Like there was a lot of grief because I felt like I lost this imaginary best friend. And it also like my whole life was kind of invested in this. And I had just finished training to be a poseket marot, which is just in the laws of family purity. When a woman bleeds, she needs to, once she stops bleeding, she needs to make sure that she's pure again and that none of her staining, natural staining that happens is considered impure blood. And usually what women have to do is go to a male rabbi and show them their freaking underwear, a piece of cloth, and get it it needs to be cleared as pure. And even as a religious person, I was like, it's like so invasive that you have to do this with a man. Why aren't there women that can do this? And I remember women usually aren't allowed to do psak halacha. How do you say that in English?
Rabbinical declarations.
Yeah. But with women's issues, women are allowed to. So I was like, okay, I'm halachically or rabbinically allowed to do this. So I studied the art of deeming stains
Underwear stains.
on underwear, pure or impure. So I had just finished this training. So I was super invested in it. And you were a rabbi and we were we had relationships in our communities. I had no idea how my parents were going to react based on how they had reacted to my sibling. I was like, this is going to be a shit show. I didn't know we were also going to get divorced and that was going to just be lumped into the shit show. Like, that wasn't clear to me at the time, but it was really scary. And it was really like heartbreaking. Like, I really felt like I lost a person, I suppose, and like a sense of meaning as well.
It's interesting just reviewing some of the things you said. You were able to have a debate with your father right around the time when it was ending around potentially leaving religion, and at least, I don't know if he knew that you would take action, but it was seemingly you were able to go to him and have that conversation. That's one thing that strikes me.
Yeah, I'm not sure, how I am with timelines. Like, linearly, I'm not actually sure where that took place. I remember it being pivotal. And I'm not sure if it was like slightly after it happened where it like sort of confirmed the thing that I had arrived at on my own, or like maybe a few weeks before, but it was in that broader envelope of this transition. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's equally fascinating that he would even acknowledge that there's any leap of faith, because everything I was raised on was that there's 100% guaranteed. And the argument usually, like discovery or whatever, their argument was always that nothing is ever 100% certain. So it's not so much that anybody's taking a leap of faith. It's that you approach with the same certainty that you would crossing the street. You could also believe in God. There's a more abstract, are we all brains in a jar kind of question, but nobody actually lives that way. That's not really faith so much as how you live your life. So it's interesting that he did acknowledge that quite verbally.
I think he brought that up. He said nothing is for sure. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not basing my entire life on my capacity to cross the street, or like, you hear what I'm saying? Like, I think he did try making that argument.
Yeah. The stakes are higher than almost anything else.
The stakes are higher in literally every way, every part of your current life, every part of the afterlife, if that's what you're choosing to believe. It's like literally everything is within this. So it has higher stakes than crossing the freaking strait, or like believing in the flying spaghetti monster, or that we're brains in a jar. Like, all of those examples aren't as consequential to our well-being. Like, okay, maybe I am a brain in a jar, but I can be a happy brain in a jar. Right?
Yeah. So it's interesting, as you left, there was two things happening. There's internally, it's all at once. And I heard from you like a lot of loneliness, like a breakup, and then, or heartbreak. You didn't say loneliness, heartbreak. And then an external gradualness. And I'm curious, was there anybody that you were able to confide in? Was it like the life coach or anybody else that you had arrived at that decision, or did it remain internal? And then conversely, I'm curious how you knew, maybe intuitively, to take it slowly, externally.
Right. Yeah. I can't think of anyone. I think that I knew only a few people that were not religious, and it felt like telling them would become about something different than what was happening to me. It would be about maybe they'd be very congratulatory, which is not what I was feeling. I think that's one thing I was afraid of, that they'd be like, oh, yay, you've made it to the right side. Or like, as you like to say, we have cookies, non-kosher cookies. That wasn't my headspace. I was like, I don't want to be congratulated for this awful thing that's happening to me. Like, I really felt like I begrudgingly arrived at this conclusion. I didn't want it to be true. I was totally hoping and preferring for the conclusion to my like extensive research, I guess, to be, oh yeah, God totally exists. Continue on with your merry life. Like, that's what I was hoping to arrive at. So it was quite devastating. And I felt like any of the non-religious people that I knew would just not get it. They seemed so like happy and content with their totally meaningless, godless lives. And I felt like they were never really religious to begin with, or they weren't religious in the way that I was, so they wouldn't really understand. And then I definitely couldn't talk to any religious people. Our relationship was in a totally shit place. Like, we couldn't talk to each other about much, much more basic things than this. So I definitely don't think I could talk to you about it. So yeah, really, aside from my life coach, I didn't feel like there was anyone that I could like talk to about it. What was the other part of your question? Oh, how did I know I should take it gradually? I don't know. I think that's part of the whole, like, even though I'm doing this repair work now and have been for years of like, yes, trusting myself, I think there's some like undying part that they've never been able to crush, where I always like trusted something about the innate wisdom of my system. And that's probably was there in some way.
Mhm. Was there an adjustment period once you left around like getting used to this new life? I mean, I know you took it slowly. But yeah, was there anything that, that was hard to get used to?
Yeah, I think everything was hard to get used to. Some things for sure more than others. I think the lack of meaning that I experienced was probably the biggest crisis experience. Like that was the hardest emotionally, and like maybe the social isolation. But I remember, that SNL clip that we both like, where he's like flirting with this girl really aggressively in like, the French croissant one.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. How would you describe the clip?
So there's they're both women, which is the best part. There's a woman in the theater just trying to watch a movie. And there's
Right.
another person, like one row behind her, who just keeps interrupting and
Like
telling her,
he's playing a guy or she's
Yeah.
playing a guy.
yeah, exactly. There's a guy behind her who keeps saying things like, girl, the back of your head is ridiculous.
See, that's the back of your head. It was that specific line. I remember when I stopped covering my hair and I went from not covering my hair to like a band for a period of time, I think. And I remember like leaving the house and I felt like everyone was just like saying that to me with their eyes. They were all like, the back of your head is ridiculous. And like, I think it was a good learning moment in the sense that nobody actually gives a shit what you do. Like in those communities, obviously I was being watched. Like people stopped talking to me in the elevator. So people I knew gave a shit. But just walking down the street, like it's not like I knew everyone. And most people don't notice. Like it was definitely good in that sense. Like I remember learning that lesson real hard, where I was like, oh, they don't care if I wear pants. No one's tracking me. And that was part of also leaving this community where people are absolutely tracking you. Like I remember in elementary school, I once wore Winnie the Pooh socks to a friend's house after school. And then I got called into the principal's office the next day that someone in the neighborhood saw me wear Winnie the Pooh socks just like outside of school. So it was like, I was absolutely being watched. People definitely cared about things that were none of their business. And this was like part of the healing process almost, was for me to do these things that I was taught were extremely scandalous, were experienced as scandalous in this tiny little insular community. But then when I did them, nothing of consequence really happened, broadly speaking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The joke that I have to say is that you uncovering your hair is the Orthodox Jewish equivalent of assless chaps.
Worse. Yeah, I don't know. It's really bad.
Assless chaps of the head. Anyway,
Which I find funny because all chaps are assless.
exactly. But we must be specific.
Yes.
So, yeah, how long did it take for you to stabilize?
Who said I've stabilized?
No one. Least of all me.
Huh. I don't know what you mean by that exactly. I think in some ways, and I like it. Yeah, I said it's a joke, like who said I've stabilized, but in some way, there was this void that happened that I think I still keep trying to fill in different ways. And then I catch it and I drop it. And it's like almost like some taste of that happening again, that deconstructing. It's just now I'm deconstructing different things over and over and over again. And I don't know if this is something all humans have, or it's like much more pronounced in my life, or it's just, I don't know. I think it's also hard a little bit to divorce it from divorcing you, like that period we like separated within a few months of that happening, of me leaving. And it took a while for me to stabilize after that. But I want to say like within a few years, probably I was more stable than I was when I was religious and married to you. Yeah.
So on this search for meaning, which just seems to be a recurring theme, I'm curious, well, I guess more broadly, was there things that did help you find comfort, find community that have helped you on that journey out over the years? And I'm curious specifically about meaning and how that quest has been.
I think the thing that's helped me most with meaning is understanding why I feel I need it. Like there's usually like an underlying sense of something is wrong. Something is wrong with me, something is wrong with the world that I need to fix. And so recognizing that that's where it's coming from, and then sort of like just, yeah, understanding that, letting go of that, being with that in whatever form it takes really helps, because like the quest for meaning feels like a distraction actually from the
Sam
thing that's
Harris,
driving it.
the Sam Harris principle that like
It exactly says this.
people are really happy don't search for meaning kind of thing.
I think I've heard him say basically that exact thing, but he's like not the only person I've heard say this. Yeah, I think meditation has really, really helped me in, well, yeah, basically every way. And that's by the way where the tracking thing comes back online for me in terms of earlier on I said I felt like the fact that God was always with me and I was never alone is something that fucked me up. But I also feel like it could be that it's contributed to this like greater sense of like, I don't know, I'm never alone. Maybe from a more like meta perspective or a more like loving awareness or just awareness perspective or something like that. It's like borrowing something there, something foundational that's existed in my system for a lot longer than meditation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Am I totally screwing with your interview questions?
no, it's actually going so smoothly that I don't know, like surely we're missing something here, but I'm getting a pretty, it's very you for there to not be story so much as a theme that summarizes 30 years. And then you've summarized it in 3 minutes because you've already meditated on it for a year. And then it's just kind of, you're done. But I guess, like reflecting back on it all, I'm curious. I think your perspective is quite unique because a lot of people, for example, would celebrate meaning as like one of the biggest quests, stuff like that, or be done. And I don't think you see yourself as done. So I'm curious what your advice would be to somebody else who's in the process of leaving religion.
I don't know. The words that are coming to me are work on repairing your heart or something about recognizing how fundamentally intact you are. Because I feel like so much of the messaging is that you're like broken, in need of salvation, don't actually know what's good for you. And I feel like maybe starting in like very small ways is a good way to start. Like I wouldn't do this in hugely life consequential ways, but like, yeah, I strongly believe that, first of all, I don't think there really is anything else to trust. It's all we got. And I also just strongly believe that we do have an innate sense of, I don't love using right or wrong here because I don't really think it's useful to borrow religious language for this. But I think that there is a lot to be said for trusting your, I don't know, your body, your psyche, your soul, whatever, however you relate to it, and moving towards or away from things or people or activities or behaviors or communities, really like trusting that there's some wisdom there. Even if like the sense is to move away and then later on the sense is to come back or vice versa. And I think that's something that gets so screwed up in religion. It's like it gets so fundamentally undermined. And it's like really, really sad. Well, I find it really like sad in my own system, or there's like a lot of grief about that. So yeah, I don't know if that's like actionable, helpful, but that feels like something I need to remember and hear a lot.
Hmm.
Yeah.
The trusting of the self and our internal guidance mechanisms.
something like that, or trusting of our goodness, I would say, even more than just like broad trusting of the self, like trusting your innate goodness, your well-intentioned flailing toward something that is best for you and hopefully other people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I've heard anyone say it as clearly as you, especially in the Jewish space. In the different groups that I've interviewed, only a little bit of Muslims, but they're like very fixated on the laws. Judaism is sort of like this hybrid Muslim Christian thing. And then Christians, they often talk about this like original sin and how much it fucks them up. It's like your inherently unworthy bit. And Judaism has it, not to the degree that Christian does, but they have it. It's this nice little undercurrent of your shit. And I definitely relate to that from my life. So I guess my question is, it feels like
I just want to say something. I think I have a very particular flavor of it that's actually quite like intellectualized in some way, where it's like you can't trust your heart. I think that's actually like really what my childhood leaned into. It's like you can't trust your heart. Your brain is actually more trustworthy, first of all. And then second of all, this like external system that your brain has chosen is the one that will know. And there's something about continuously like having some kind of gut reaction towards something while you're growing up, right, wrong, whatever, like, don't like, and then like learning to shut it down over and over and over again and not trust it or shame yourself or feel guilt for having fallen for it in that particular moment. That's just like, I think in my experience requires a lot of repair and like patience. Yeah.
Yeah. And it tracks with how you described your father specifically and how he approached religion. And then
he's been hugely influential. I will say to his credit, like the other day, even I told him that I feel like I get my liberal tendencies from him, even though he's like, in the way he behaves and lives his life, so conservative in every way. And he sort of was like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I also remember having a conversation with him a little while after I left religion. I want to say a few months, because initially we weren't really on speaking terms. I remember him saying, what happened? Like, you had a good childhood. That was his framing of it. Everything was fine. Like, what happened? And I remember saying the same thing to him. I was like, what happened to you? You had a good childhood, right? Like, you decided to leave everything that you grew up with and become a crazy, like, you're so religious, like a rabbi in Jerusalem, making other people religious. And he really took that point too. He was like, you're right. Like, maybe this isn't a sign that something bad happened to you. And I think his capacity to concede points and have these conversations with me, I don't know. Like, and we're very similar in lots of ways. So yeah, I think he's shaped so many like of the foundations of my psyche, I guess, for lack of a better term. I keep finding evidence of him in my exploring my own mind.
In the last few minutes, I wanted to give you the opportunity to flip the tables, as I always like to do, and ask you if you have any questions for me. And we've already done an hour and a half, so in the past.
Of me asking you questions.
Yeah, but in the moment.
Well, so you really wanted to interview me for this podcast, and I'm curious if like this is what you were hoping for. Did you get what you wanted?
I got my 21st episode.
Okay. That doesn't feel like it's personal, really.
Thanks for having a pulse.
You're welcome.
I think what strikes me of your as usual, a journey is very unconventional. I think I can broadly group a lot of the different styles of how people leave religion, at least among specific religion. Like there's a pattern of how a lot of Christians leave Christianity, and a pattern of how a lot, or 3 styles of leaving Christianity, 3 styles of leaving Judaism. Yours kind of fits into one, which is like the intellectual journey out in a way. But it's interesting because there is still a lot of emotionality in there for you. And I think more important still, like the advice you give at the end, I think is very unconventional, because I don't think most people go that deep or feel that deeply. And I think it's telling. You do have some very indicative like stories that are like very specific, but the sense I get from you is the stories are often not the point. It's this very thematic journey.
I had to do an assignment for my sexuality and education class, something like that, where I had to talk about my sexual experiences from like childhood to today, basically. And it was actually so helpful for me to have like a theme to look at my life through. And I felt like I could, if anyone were to ever ask me about my childhood, it would be useful for me to be asked in a thematic way, like, or maybe tell me about the schools you've been to. Tell me about like having a through line of some particular aspect that I'm looking at, I think helps me. I'm not, as you know, like I'm not a very linear thinker or rememberer of things, including my own like life experience. So yeah, that's broadly how it works in my brain.
Yeah. And that reminds me of narrative therapy and how narrative therapy often seems to be structured. But specifically, I would say that I think that's welcome here. Like, I don't think we need to explore specific themes. I think whatever comes up for you is the theme in this context.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Aviva, for joining us for our amazing 21st podcast. If it wasn't for you, it would be somebody else, but this was great.
Reminds me of Tim Minchin's, if it wasn't you, somebody else would do. Remember his
Exactly.
song?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. This was more fun than I thought it would be.
That should be our tagline.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.